Hey everybody, I'm Kent Dobson. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to C3. We're an inclusive spiritual community here in West Michigan. And yeah, thanks for tuning in today. Thanks for listening each week, or thanks for listening occasionally. And thanks for sharing this. It makes a huge difference. Meaning telling your friends about C3, sharing our teachings and musicians with the world, posting about them on your social media feeds. Amazingly, over the last year, our online community has really grown, and we're really surprised and grateful for that. And we want that to continue. We're just now beginning talks of getting back together in person. We ordinarily meet in Grand Haven, as many of you know, at the community center in Grand Haven, and we're talking about how and when to do that. Our hope is to get together the first Sunday of each month in the summer, so May, June, July, and August, getting together the first Sunday of the month. That's our tentative plan, but of course we're watching the numbers, we're talking to the community center. So please pay attention in the next couple weeks, particularly about May, how and when we might be able to do that. So sign up for the newsletter, read the newsletter, it has all kinds of other good stuff in there. Stay connected to see if and how and when we might be able to get together in person. But we're going to continue to offer things online, offer our teachings and musicians online, so you won't miss anything no matter what. Which also actually reminds me of, that next week, very special guest we're bringing in. His name is Casper Churchill. He just wrote a book called The Power of Ritual. The subtitle is something like Turning Everyday Practices or Activities into Soulful Practices, The Power of Ritual. He's an amazing person and a great writer. He went to Harvard Divinity School, interestingly enough, as an agnostic or as an atheist, and didn't grow up with a religious background at all. And the book is fascinating. He talks about the changing landscape of spirituality and religion in America and in Europe, in the world. What the heck is going on? And also asking questions like, well, what is lost and what is gained? And do we still need rituals, and how rituals can help, really, can help orient us toward a life of meaning. So definitely tune in next week. You'll love the teaching, and very cool from my point of view. I also got to interview him, so it's a bit of a teaching and an interview combined, and I think you're really going to like it. So that's next week, 10 a.m., same time. Oh, and if you're into Harry Potter, by the way, he's also the co-host of a very well-known podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. It's reading Harry Potter as sacred text. Has something like 22 million downloads. So if you're a Harry Potter fan, check that out. So that's next week. Super excited to have him as a guest, and we've got some interesting guests coming in the coming weeks and months. So stay tuned. Okay. That's an introduction. You are joining us in the middle of a year-long series that I've called Meaning Matters. And each week and each month, we take a look at a different word. Our word for the month. Our word for this month is paradox. And we're trying to ask something like, what does this word have to teach us and show us, reveal to us? What happens if we think about it and talk about it, contemplate it? And so the word for this month is paradox. And paradox means to cast alongside opinion. Or you could say to cast two opinions alongside one another. Or you could say to make distinction, or to place distinction alongside something. Or maybe to put it more simply, less etymologically, to put two opposing things alongside. That's what a paradox is. And maybe an even simpler way of saying it, to put two truths that seem opposed alongside one another and see what happens. That's a paradox. This and that. Of course, we live in a very either-or world. Distinctions. This and not that. And of course, that has a time and a place. But on the deeper level of human consciousness, of human reality, we often bump into things that cannot be so easily divided out. It seems like this is true and this is true, and yet they seem like they're in tension. For example, no doubt it's a fact we're mortal, we're all going to die. And yet there's something about even consciousness, about humanity, or maybe you could say of existence, that touches the eternal. So which is it? Is it temporal? Is it eternal? And a paradox is the capacity to hold those in tension. And the resonance between, like a tuning fork, creates a kind of field. And I'd like to suggest maybe here at the beginning that maturity looks like the capacity to hold greater and greater paradox. That's my view. Not that I'm, speaking from a place of, great maturity, but I'd like to be on the path. I'd like to be on the path of spiritual maturity, which is, in this sense, the capacity to hold the tension of opposites long enough for occasionally a kind of third to emerge, a third way of being, we might say, a third way of holding that isn't so much about resolving, but the capacity to hold things. And paradox has been an insight that the great traditions and teachers, and from Greek philosophers to Zen monks, have tried to invite us to get close to. Get close to paradox. Let the poles challenge who you think you are in the world. So what I want to do today is talk about the paradox of I. The paradox of the word I. What do we mean when we say I? And I'm not going to so much answer that, but just to kind of explore some terrain. And the place I want to start is with a well-known poem. Just one line of it. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. That's a very famous Robert Frost line. Two roads diverge in a wood, or maybe it's two roads diverge in a snowy wood, and I took the road less traveled by. I don't actually know if it says snowy, it just popped into my head. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by. Now, this is the kind of poem you might hear at the end of a college graduation speech. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and it's made all the difference, and take the road less traveled. And I say, wait a minute, not so fast. There's something almost clever and trickster-like in this line, because he uses the word I twice. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by. Who is the I? Why are there two? What part of us is the chooser here? What part of us chooses the road? And how do I know that it's made all the difference? And I mean, maybe the older I get, the more I realize how little of the I that chose a path was really involved. Like right now, I'm giving a talk. I'm looking into this camera. I'm giving a talk for C3. I'm in a garage that I've renovated. None of this was part of a plan. Like, I'm going to take the road less traveled by, and it's going to look like X. That doesn't mean the will or the I is not involved in how I ended up in this place. But it feels like, how did I end up here? How did I end up doing any of this? How did I end up being into the things that I'm into, reading the things that I love to read? How much of the I, who I think I am, is involved? And I don't want to answer that. I just want to hold it there. Two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. I think he's being a little more trickster-like than we often hear in this poetic line. Which brings me to my next point. I've been thinking a bit about St. Paul. You know, he's one of those people that even religious people, Paul gives us difficulty. He's hard to understand, and he seems to contradict in himself, and he's kind of wild and passionate and all over the place. And I remember even 10 or 15 years ago, I would say something like, I'm into the teachings of Jesus, but Paul, not so much. But I've changed my mind on like tons of things, but one of them being, actually, I find Paul kind of wildly provocative and very human. Here's the line I'm thinking of. I do not understand what I do. I do not understand what I do. There's a double use of I. Who is the I speaking here? And how can I not understand what I am doing? But he says, I do not understand what I'm doing. And he goes on to say, for what I want to do, I do not do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. Talk about an honest admission. I don't know what I'm doing. What I want to do, I don't do. What I hate, I do. Who's the I at work here? What does it mean to be a person, an individual, an I? And I love the kind of paradoxical statement that Paul is revealing here. There's conflict between who I think I am and my will and what I ought to do and what I'm actually up to in the world. So who's the I here? And I'm also thinking now of Eckhart Tolle. So in his book, The Power of Now, it begins with a story. And Eckhart describes a life. He's a college student or a graduate student, I don't remember which. And he's in a state of real depression. And he's riding on a train, if my memory serves me correctly. And he sees someone who's kind of talking to themselves out loud. That internal monologue that we keep internal has slipped out. And we might say in contemporary language, that person's a bit crazy or off or you know, something like that. They have a disorder, we'd be quick to label. Maybe the only difference is they don't have the mute button on. So Eckhart Tolle is in a bathroom washing his hands, looking in the mirror, and he hears himself say, I hope I don't end up like him, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing because it's been a while since I've read The Power of Now, but I hope I'm not like him, or I hope I don't end up like him. And all of a sudden he has a flash of consciousness that he says this out loud. And it's like, who is the I that's speaking? And it shatters his world, really. It shatters his world. It breaks him through into a kind of deeper consciousness. So it's kind of a terrible moment of realization and also a kind of breakthrough. It's a breakthrough and breakdown, like which, talk about a paradox. Is it a breakdown? Yes. Is it a breakthrough? Yes. So it brings again the question of who's the I involved here? Who's the I involved? How can I be conscious of I? How can I be conscious of the I who is speaking? I wrote about this in a little bit in my book, Bitten by a Camel, where I had this strange experience one Sunday while teaching at Mars Hill, where I was employed at the time. And here I am as a megachurch pastor walking around the stage, and I had this almost what I would call out-of-body experience where something or some other part of the I whispered, suggested, or I became aware of, and it came out in the form of a question. Who is the one talking here? What is that guy talking about? That was more of the feeling. What's that guy talking about? Meaning the one who's walking around giving a sermon. And it really disturbed me. Actually, I sort of made a commitment. I'm not going to speak in public until I sort this out. Now, I broke this commitment because I had to get up and keep doing it, but it really shook me up. Who's the I involved here? What do we mean by I? And another thing I might sort of add to the mix here when it comes to what I might start to call the I as a plurality is just a hint from the religious tradition. So in the Greek pantheon, you have all kinds of gods and goddesses. You have 24 main gods and goddesses. In Christianity, you have the Trinity. In Hindu religion, you have the concept of one and many sort of being blurred. But there's a kind of plurality and a kind of oneness at the same time. It's getting us close to that sort of paradox that I talked about the first week. But my question actually has to do with a sort of mirroring. So if several great religious traditions think about the gods or God as a plurality, my question is, what does that tell us about human nature? Well, I'd like to suggest it mirrors back to us a bit of our own plurality. Like the I. What do we mean? Who's the I? Who's the one making decisions? And are there other characters in there who are making decisions? So I think there's even a kind of clue in the great world religions that what we think of as human individual consciousness is quite complicated. And sometimes we feel like a plurality, like Walt Whitman says, do I contradict myself? I contain multitudes. I think this is someone who's coming into an awareness of the multiplicity of being. I contain a whole cosmos in there. So if that's true, I'm going to contain some contradictions, like Paul saying, what I hate, I do. And what I want to do, I do not do. Do I contradict myself? Yes, indeed, I do. I contain multitudes. That's the path toward humility, which I know I need to be on, and we all need to be on. Yep, I may preach a good sermon. I may make a fantastic and timely Facebook post. I may really call out the establishment on Instagram and participate in some of the same behavior because I contain multitudes and I contradict myself. Welcome back to earth, we might say. You know, and Glennon Doyle Melton is quite a well-known writer at this point. I heard her say once, I'll never betray that inner voice. And actually, when I first started, I thought, yeah, me too. And then later I thought, as I got to know myself better, which one? I'll never betray that inner voice. Yeah, but which one? I contain multitudes. Some of them are quite maybe not worth trusting so much. So maybe I want to say I want to do a kind of drive-through map here of the inner world. And this is only a map. Basically, I'm going to paraphrase some Carl Jung here and some Murray Stein, who wrote a book called Jung's Map of the Soul. This has been a book that's been pretty influential in my own life. So I'm giving you kind of a McDonald's drive-through version of this map, but I think you'll find it helpful and interesting. And the thing about maps is that it's not the same as the terrain. So I'm not asking you to believe or disbelieve and even argue with the map. A map is a map. It gives us a visual image of the complexity of the psyche of human life. And, you know, maps are either helpful or they're not. I find this particular one helpful. What seems to be true behind the map is that we contain multitudes. So one way of thinking about the I is by a kind of archaeological dig. And I'm going to go through it really briefly. This is the drive-through version again. So at the top of the dig is something that Jung called the persona. Persona means mask. Again, a Greek word, a mask, like an actor wears. The persona is the face you put out there to the world. And you can put that out there consciously or unconsciously, or probably a combination of both. How am I perceived? How would I like to be perceived? That's the persona. That's your Facebook profile picture. That's your Instagram post. Every single one of them. Persona, 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 persona. Here I am. I'm guilty of it too. Hey, check out my latest podcast. There's an element of, oh, that's the mask that I have put on. It's not bad, by the way. As soon as you say mask, you think, oh, that must be wrong. It's not wrong. It's how we learn to maneuver in the world. One of the questions is, how much consciousness can we bring to our personas? Anyway, that's the top of the archaeological dig. Just beneath that is the ego. And ego means I, the I that I'm consciously aware of. And here's a fun fact for you. Freud and Carl Jung never used the word ego, not one time. They used the German word for I. It's just when the translators of Freud and Jung got to English, I sounded too simple, so they decided to go with the Latin word, ego. And hence the ego is born in the modern lexicon, by the way. So, simple fact, but it points to something that the ego is just the I, who I think I am. That's what I always like to remind people. The ego is just who you think you are. That's it. Who at any given moment, what am I aware of? What is the I that I'm aware of? That's the ego. So persona, digging deeper, ego. Beneath the ego is what depth psychologists call sub-personalities. They're energies. I like to think about them as a whole village of energies, little people, that can take over the ego. They're very much a part of the whole being, but it sometimes feels like I'm not in control of them. I just use air quotes if you're listening on the podcast. What are subpersonalities? The wounded child, the victim, the tyrant. These are archetypal subpersonalities. The escapist, the addict. And we could go on and on, a whole list of subpersonalities. And it does actually feel like it's what people mean when they say they get triggered or hooked. They're activated, and their ego, their I, is taken over by an energy that, if they're healthy, might last something like 30 seconds to a half a day. If they're unhealthy, and all of us, I go through phases of this, you might be taken over by a subpersonality for months or weeks or days, ruminating and possessed. Those are subpersonalities. So we're digging down. Persona, ego, subpersonalities. Beneath that is something that Carl Jung called the shadow. That's the deeper part of what we don't know about ourselves. The things that got stuffed into the black box. And they're down there, and we don't even know they exist. Really, a technical definition of the shadow, if you listen to my talks about it before, is what we don't know about ourselves. And it's down there. The I doesn't know anything about it. And every once in a while, that shadow comes out of hiding. And as soon as I say shadow, people think negative, and there's a negative component to it. There's a darkness there. But shadow is both the villainous components, what we don't know are down there, what we would deny for sure if accused of, but also our golden threads. Perhaps little bits of our own glory that we can't look at. So the shadow is a very mysterious realm. And down we go. So persona, ego, subpersonalities, shadow. Beneath that, we might use a word like soul. Soul is a bit hard to define, as I've tried to do in the past. A bit of our true self, to use Thomas Merton's language. An image that reflects something of our essence. To quote Bill Plotkin, our ecological niche in the world, the place where we most belong, our truest way of being in the world, something of our deep selves that if we're not in alignment with, it's going to wreak havoc on our life. And part of the soul path is recovering a relationship with this deeper self, with the image we were born with, and to say it kind of poetically. So you see, the deeper I go, the harder it is to talk about. Now, beneath all that, we've got persona, ego, subpersonalities, shadow, soul or sense of soul. Beneath all that, we have the self with a capital S. And that's just from Carl Jung. Carl Jung says there's a self, and the self is eternal. It's nameless. It's an abyss. It's the thing that activates and animates our life that we will never, ever grasp. The I, the ego, will never, ever understand, control, or manipulate or explain self on that level. And it's almost like the mysteries of life, the bubbling of the cauldron. Maybe the soul, this is Kent's opinion, maybe the soul refracts light like a stained glass window of the deep self, of the abyss, of the nameless, of the eternal. And it's like a stained glass window. We just get little glimpses. The soul gives us little glimpses of what is just out of reach of the ego. Now, that's just a map, just a map. Why did I give it to you? Just to say simply, what we mean by I is complicated. And maybe part of maturity looks like being in conversation with the complexity of our own being. Let me put it even more simply, getting to know your subs, your sub-personality, getting to know your persona. I mean, that's a monumental leap. I'm sure I have personas that I've yet to discover, but when I first started to bump into, wait a minute, is this a mask? It was very humiliating. It was enlightening and humiliating at the same time. Have I been just wearing a mask? Have I been pretending? God, what would it look like if I became more conscious of that? Just to get to know the I, and maybe that there's more than one I took the road less traveled by. There's an observer of the I. This is what you often gain just by a very basic meditation practice. The one who watches the flow of thoughts. What is that thing that's generating thoughts? And what is the I that's able to watch the thoughts emerge from the ether? So how well do you know yourself? How well are you in conversation with the complexity of your own being, with the multitude, with the archaeological dig? Maybe you don't want to, because there's always an element of the ego that's afraid. We're afraid of what's down there. And I'm still afraid of what's down there. And I feel like I've done a lot of work. I probably really haven't done that much work, but I've tried. I've put myself in scenarios that have broken that open a bit, and I think, yep, and there's more. And I'm afraid. I'm a bit afraid of what's down there because we don't feel always in control of it. Who's in control of the abyss? Well, you're not. Who's in control of the self, as Jung would say, the eternal and nameless and transcendent deepest part, perhaps the part of us that touches God, like Adam and God on the chapel ceiling, on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, touching. That's really the place where God and the divine meet. Well, I don't understand that very well, and that's a bit frightening. So, I'm going to read something to take this one step further, and then I'll try to say something practical, and that'll be it. Here's Teilhard de Chardin. Here's what he says it's like. The paradox of I here. I took the lamp, and leaving the zone of everyday occupations and relationships where everything seemed clear. So I took a lamp and I left the zone, I love the language here, of everyday occupations, roles, personas, jobs, titles, everyday occupations and relationships, where everything seemed clear, I went down into my inmost self. So here's an acknowledgement of the question of what do we mean by I? What do we mean by the self? So it says, I left that zone of occupations and I went into my inmost self to the deep abyss whence I feel dimly that my power of action emanates. Some power of action seems to emanate from something deep. So he's curious about this. So I took a lamp. I struck that lamp. Like we're going into Hades here. And I went down to the deep abyss, whence I feel dimly that my power of action emanates. But as I moved further and further away from conventional certainties, everything I think I know, as I move further and further away from conventional certainties by which social life is superficially illuminated, all my certainties are just illuminating something that's superficial. I became aware that I was losing contact with myself. I became aware that I was losing contact with myself, with the I. You might interpret it as the ego, I don't know. Seems like a fair interpretation. I became aware that I was losing contact with myself. At each step of the descent, because that's what it feels like, a new person was disclosed within me. Subpersonalities and shadows and soul. And it's like I'm going deeper and deeper and deeper. With each step of the descent, a new person was disclosed within me, of whose name I was no longer sure. Talk about an admission. I don't know what I'm bumping into. And who no longer obeyed me. Now we're getting into the complexity of being. You mean there are parts of my being that don't obey my will, my I? And then he says this, and when I had to stop my exploration because the path faded beneath my steps, I found a bottomless abyss at my feet. And out of it came, arising, I know not from where, the current, which I dare call my life. I found a bottomless abyss at my feet, and out of it came, arising I know not from where, the current which I dare call my life. There's a kind of posture of not knowing that's evident here, and a kind of wonder and awe. I think I know myself. I have persons that don't even obey me. And beneath all that is an abyss. But out of that abyss is the current, which I dare call my life. That wells up from somewhere. This is someone, of course, Teilhard de Chardin is a mystic, really. His experience of life, he's tasted or felt or experienced the current. And he's dared to try to bring some language to it. And the language that he's bringing is paradoxical. This is someone who's willing to face the paradoxes of I. What do I mean by I? What do I mean when I say my life? I did it my way, Really? That's as small as you can imagine your life? That's a pretty small imagination. I did it my way. Because there's an abyss down there, out of which emerges the current that I dare call my life. So, I don't know what you heard today in this brief conversation about the paradox of I. Maybe just a couple real practical things I want to say in closing. I'd like to say, maybe it's time that we go easy on ourselves, really. In this sense, you're a mystery to yourself. You're a mystery to yourself. And that requires a certain amount of grace and compassion turned inward. Now, we definitely need to extend grace and compassion to other people, but we also need the same toward the complexities of being, because otherwise, a subpersonality, the tyrant, the shamer takes over. How dare you contradict yourself? So there's a kind of relaxation into, yep, I'm complex. And admitting it feels humbling and also a relief. That's how it feels to me. I had an image of like when two people get married, there's kind of like, if you've ever been to a wedding of any sort, which I'm sure you have, there's like a kind of sweet naivety that's present. Like all these two people love each other, appear to so much. And you also know they don't know anything about the person they're standing in front of. Really? Now they think they do. I met my soulmate. I felt like we always, I've known this person forever, we're the same, we're one. But the rest of us who've been around the block think, oh, this is beautiful. And it's true. Maybe it's a paradoxical truth, but also they don't know anything about the person that's standing next to them. And there's an even deeper truth. They don't know anything about themselves, or very little. So this is just a kind of compassion. This calls for a kind of compassion toward the mystery of our own being. I don't know that much about myself, much less the other person. Much less the other person that, especially if I'm finger pointing and putting down and labeling and categorizing and saying, well, they're this, and well, you don't understand, they're like this, and I barely know myself, let's be honest. And I think in the 21st century, we would be doing the world a great service by treating ourselves first as a kind of mystery so that we can turn around and do the same to other people. I think these are practical ways of admitting the paradox of I. I don't know what I'm talking about when I even explain myself to myself, much less to other people. So, maybe that's as much as I want to say right now. I hope you heard a hint, a guess, a clue for your own path, for your own story, for your own journey, for your own unfolding, for your own road that you're walking, that you're making by walking. I wish you well. I wish you health and well-being and increased consciousness and wholeness. And I wish you a little insight this week into the complexities of your own being. And I wish you a little relaxation and compassion toward the mystery of your own existence. And maybe, if you're lucky, toward the mystery of the people that we're in relationship with. So peace. I'll see you all soon.